Mary Hellen Dellinger, 1990. History. He was a visiting professor there. I'm not quite sure what his actual title was. And I knew him by taking his class. I think that's the only one he taught, but yes, that's the one I took. So I remember sitting there thinking, I was a senior when I took it. I'm looking at a living history. I mean, right in front of me, just straight out of the pages of a history book. And I remember learning things about the civil rights movement that I didn't know. I liked the fact that the class addressed a lot of the, I don't want to call it the pre-movement because it was all the movement, I guess, but a lot of the early things from the 1950s. He talked a lot about that, things that I'd never gone into before, and then quite a bit of time about his personal experiences literally on the front lines in the South. I have to say it was probably the best class I've ever taken. I've completed the graduate courses at George Mason University. So yeah, that's hands down the best class. I describe him as a very compassionate person, one that despite all of his experiences, wanted to share. He wasn't bitter in the least, didn't harbor any kind of animosity towards anybody, and was very eager for us to understand his story. So, you know, as to not repeat those types of things, try and make us better people, I guess you could say. I remember my favorite memory is the laugh he had. He had a James Earl Jones kind of voice, one of those really deep voices. You probably can look him up online, and I know there's recordings of him out there. But that voice, and when he would laugh, even though at that time he was blind and had to be brought into class in a wheelchair, he had an aide that brought him in. And he wore his little signature eye patch, but he still couldn't see. His whole face would light up when he would remember something that was fondly, or a person fondly, or when somebody would ask a question that made him laugh. I know that's not really a historical type of answer, but that's the thing that I remember the most, is sitting there thinking everything he's been through, what people did to him solely because of the color of his skin. And yet he sits here and shares that story with the room of, we were all white students. I mean, he wouldn't know that, but I mean, there wasn't one minority student in the room. And he just, you know, it was like he's just telling a story. Well, I think that it was always, you know, that we shouldn't judge other people. I, at that time, was my roommate, my college roommate, sophomore, junior, and senior year, and still one of my very best friends, was a minority student. She had been adopted by a white family as a young infant, and brought to the States and was a U.S. citizen. And I think it made me see her life experiences a little bit differently. You know, just to live with somebody that goes through the world and experiences the world differently than I do. I think that was one thing that, you know, I kind of learned from him. Does that answer your question? Well, this was in the late 80s, obviously. So the civil rights movement wasn't even 25 years old at that point, 30 years old. There were a lot of people that lived through that, both sides of it, and remembered it. And I know that it was either Dateline or Nightline or one of the big news programs at the time had been to Fredericksburg at that point and had interviewed a lot of people. It was a big, big story. We all watched it on the TVs in the dorms to talk about how racism was still a problem. So I think to sit in his class and to kind of be exposed to, you know, that story, that was such an experience. You know, living in a different time. I can't say that it's any better now. I don't know. I'm not a minority person, but to be living through that, I guess that's a good answer. I do definitely. I have 2 copies of his book, one in hardcover, one in softcover, both autographed. He was able to still do that. And I've read them more than once. And I do think about that sometimes when I see on the news about racial injustice, or when I you know, have dealings with people of color or minority people, you know, I sometimes I can just hear his voice in my head talking about the injustices that he felt, and I always try and think I'd like to do a better job as a person. Again, I moved through the world as a white woman, and so that's how I experience the world. And so I think that colors everything that I do. And so it's good that I've had this class to kind of remember, you know, that there are people out there that experience horrible things every day based on just what they look like, or what they might sound like. So that's a thing that I carry with me, and I think it does have an impact. Yes, definitely more of a presence today than there was when I was a student. I mean, obviously he was still a teacher there. Since that time, obviously he's passed away. Before he died, President Clinton awarded him the Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is, I think, the highest civilian honor we give in this country. Well deserved, long overdue. There's a statue to him out in front of what will hopefully be renamed Trinkle Hall, and I know that there's I think the Multicultural Center is named after him. So those are good steps. I was recently asked to participate in a survey about the renaming of Trinkle Hall, and I strongly suggested that it should be named for James Farmer because the statue is right across the way. So I think that's great. And I'm sure there's other things that I'm missing that I don't know. I think the school does a good job of that, but only in the Mary Washington community. I think the bigger community, if you're a Fredericksburg resident and you're walking down campus, you might not know that story. And I think it's critically important that people know that. He was one of the big four. He taught there. Very few people have more of an impact in the civil rights movement than he did. Of course, Martin Luther King is a big name, but he was just as important and doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Because if you, I can't remember what the statue says with it. I mean, obviously it identifies that all statue like that does. But I know I've been on campus with people that, because I live right by the campus, I can walk there from my home, and we'll walk our dogs there. And sometimes somebody will say, "Well, who's that?" I mean, you know, they just don't know. He's not a face that's recognized like Martin Luther King is, who was the face of the civil rights movement, but just as important, if not more important. So I know they can't just name a day after him or anything, but they, you know, yeah, I think it'd be do a good job of within the Mary Washington community, but outside not so much. So I think, you know, it's a good job that the school is doing, but they can always room to do more. You know. Ah, man, I'm trying to think. I mean, it was a very serious class. You could feel the weight of the subject as he was talking about it. And because he couldn't see, he just sat up in the front of the room and just talked. Um, you know, I don't remember. I really don't. I'm trying to think. I was kind of a serious student. I didn't fool around a lot. Um, I can't remember anything. I just remember going to his office one time and waiting for quite a while to have him sign the book. And I guess he had heard me out there and he thanked me for waiting. But I mean, I don't. He didn't really meet with his students one on one. He wasn't up on campus as much as some of the other professors. I don't know if that was due to his health or just the arrangement they had with him. But no, I can't think of anything. I'm sorry. I didn't do any of those. I just attended his classes, never missed one. Never really took any notes either. You didn't have to. I mean, you just kind of sat there and listened. And I just remember that he gave us a couple papers to write. We had any exams. I think it was more just like papers and that was it. And everybody passed if you showed up and paid halfway attention, which I don't see how you couldn't. So yeah, that's just what I remember.